Awesome. I think we're here, we're recording. Just give everybody one moment to get acclimated. Hi, everyone. My name is Andy Saldana, and I'm the Executive Director of New York Tech Alliance. Welcome to our event today, Buying and Selling Privately Held Companies, Your M&A Must Know List. We've assembled a great panel of experts here to talk you through some of these, the key things that you need to know. And we'll get right to that conversation in just a moment. But before that, just a few quick thank yous and announcements from us. Let me get to my screen. A little bit about New York Tech Alliance. We are a nonprofit organization driving access, equity, and inclusion in the New York Tech community to make it the most diverse and dynamic in the world. If you want to learn more, check us out at nytech.org. You can always get in contact with me by emailing me at andy@nytech.org as well. Just a quick statement about privacy. We do video this event, so if we do ask one of your questions that comes through the chat, it might appear on screen. If we invite you to stage, then your camera and your audio will be recorded. Again, just an FYI. Thank you to all of our wonderful annual partners that make the work that we do possible, including the ones on today's panel, like Eisner Amper and Paul Ellis Law Group. They are really fantastic community members and really help to support the founder community. We encourage you to check them out on our website, nytech.org. And then if you like what we do, you can also support the organization by making a small donation when you RSVP for one of our virtual events, by becoming an individual or corporate member of New York Tech Alliance, or by simply making a small donation on our website. You can find all of that information on our website. And then our next event is happening next Wednesday, October 20th, and we'll be talking to our fantastic partners at Insperity, along with the founder of Minerva Knows, Joaquin, and we'll be talking about how do you build better teams, culture, HR. So we encourage you to check it out. You can find that event on our website and RSVP today. A special announcement, we are partnering with the official Cybersecurity Summit here in New York next week, happening on Wednesday the 20th as well. And if you want to attend that event, we have a code for free tickets at NYTech using NYTech21. And then we also encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. It has all of our amazing content that we've created over the last couple of years, including all of the panels led by the wonderful Paul Ellis. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul. Paul is not only a board member, but an amazing lawyer and fantastic community member. And I'm so happy to introduce him. Paul, take it away.
Paul, you're on mute.
Okay, we'll try that again. Sorry about that. Thank you for that great introduction, Andy. And welcome to all. We're really excited for this event today. A lot of really outstanding content. As Andy mentioned, I'm a board member at Tech Alliance. I run this series of events on legal and financing issues for startup companies. And today's event is called Buying and Selling Privately Held Companies, Your M&A Must Know List. To present this material, we have a great panel. We have Alan Wink from Eisner Amper, Don Moore from Lincoln International, and Paul Canetti, a professor at Columbia University, as well as a serial entrepreneur. So before we get into content, we're just going to go around the screen and everyone do a brief introduction, and then we will jump right in. So again, my name is Paul Ellis. I am the managing partner of the Paul Ellis Law Group. We are a 9-lawyer firm located in Midtown, New York City. We do a lot of work with startup technology companies, small to mid-sized, frankly. Our clients are looking for us to give them creative, cost-effective solutions to their legal issues so they can focus on building and growing their businesses. We do the life cycle of issues facing startup companies. So in addition to the M&A work we're talking about today, we do formations, we do all types of financing, whether it's angel, venture capital, or seed. We do IP protection, equity plans, employment agreements, and general operational matters. All of our attorneys come out of top law schools and major New York firms. So we offer big firm expertise with the more reasonable cost structure and the personalized attention of a boutique firm. With that, I will turn it over to Alan. Alan, you're muted.
Hear me now?
Yep.
Sorry about that. Paul, thank you very much. My name is Alan Wink. I'm the Managing Director of Capital Markets for Eisner Amper. We're a global accounting and advisory firm with offices across the United States and 6 international offices. We're over 2,000 people, over 200 partners. We do a lot of work in the tech and life sciences area with startups through IPO candidates. An interesting tidbit about Eisner Amper, actually in August of this year, Eisner Amper also accepted private equity dollars. We now have a private equity partner. We accepted an investment from Tower Brook Partners, a $17 billion private equity fund with offices in New York and London. And this capital will certainly be put to good use to help us to continue to grow our brand globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Don?
Hi, thank you, Paul. My name is Don Moore. I'm a managing director at Lincoln International. We're a broad spectrum M&A firm, meaning we cover all industries, tech and non-tech. I'm based in our New York office. We have 21 offices around the world. 5 are in the U.S. and actually 16 are the rest of the world. And it attests to the fact that the M&A market is global. I spend most of my time in the cybersecurity and compliance world, and to that point, about half of my deals are cross-border. And Lincoln is broadly defined in the mid-market segment, so we focus on sort of deals between 100 million and $1 billion. And I'd say about 85% of our business is sell-side M&A. The other 15% is buy-side M&A. And we also do financing as well as portfolio valuations for financial sponsors. And I've been a banker for more than 20 years. And I started my career many years ago at Bank of America Merrill Lynch. And it's a pleasure to be here today. So thanks to the New York Tech Alliance for the opportunity to join the panel.
Thank you, Don. Paul?
Thank you, other Paul. My name is Paul Canetti, and I'm a multi-time founder. I've had 2 successful exits, both in the last year, and many more failures than that. The 2 companies that I sold, one was called Maz, which is a B2B SaaS video infrastructure platform. And the other was Bounce House, actually has since been renamed to Click Easy, which is an e-commerce platform for local service businesses. These days, I am a professor at Columbia Business School, where I teach in their MBA program. I do startup advising and investing, and I sit on strategic advisory board of a VC firm called Riverside Acceleration Capital. And I also host a podcast called Tech News for MBAs. So that's how I'm filling my time these days, and I'm very excited to be here.
Paul, thank you very much, and I like that name. Well, listen, thanks again to all of you for joining. I should mention a little bit about the concept of the panel. You have what are generally sort of your 3 principal business advisors, legal, accounting, investment banker, and then you have Paul, a successful serial entrepreneur who's been through this process. So Paul is basically here to keep us honest. So, if we're going off the rails or, I'm being a little bit facetious, but the important function of Paul here is really from the perspective of the entrepreneur, what is his experience been, the things that we are going to be talking about from the service provider side, he'll be able to talk about from the entrepreneur side, and what he's seen, and he can give sort of additional color, additional perspective. Anyway, so I'm just going to give a little bit of sort of background about what we're talking about today, and then we're going to dive in a little bit deeper on particular topics. So we got a lot of material to cover today. For those of you who are veterans of my series, you know that when we have a slide deck, we like really pack in a lot of content, and today is no exception. So we're going to start with general considerations in approaching a deal, things you need to think about at a high level. We're going to talk about the process of an M&A deal, putting your team together, NDA, LOI, and take you quickly through the different steps. We're going to talk about negotiating the LOI, things that you need to think about, and what the process is of negotiating the LOI. And then we're going to dig in a little bit deeper on particular LOI terms and issues. What are the things that usually come up in most LOIs, so you have a sense of what the big picture is like. As far as what we are not going to cover today, we are not going to be covering, Andy, if you can give me the next slide, we're not going to be covering the process of making a decision whether to sell. That's, there's a lot in there, when's the right time, is it now, is it later? We aren't going to be talking about that. We're not really going to be talking about the process of identifying buyers. That's to a great extent an investment banking function. Don is certainly someone who could advise better on that offline. We're not going to be talking about the preparation to the sale, the company preparation. I'll pause on this one for a moment, because for those who are familiar with the series that I do, they will recognize this event as sort of a part two. There are two companion sections. The first section, which we did last year, is long-term preparations for a sale. So 18 to 24 months out, what are the things you need to be thinking about to get your company ready, so that once you've got a term sheet or an LOI in hand, you're ready to go? Things like getting your corporate documents in order, positioning your company in the marketplace, identifying what are the value points that buyers are going to look at, and maximizing those. There are all sorts of issues that you can be thinking about over 1 to 2 years out to get yourself ready for a sale. For those who are really interested in this process, I'd highly recommend you watch that video. It's available on the Tech Alliance YouTube channel. You can find it on my firm's website on the resources page, but it's definitely worth watching. And then finally, we're not going to talk about wealth management considerations. Important topic. If you're going through an exit that is going to meaningfully increase your wealth, you should not be signing that deal before you have at least had a conversation with a wealth management advisor to make sure you're structuring it in a manner that's best for you personally from a estate planning perspective. So, Andy, if you can give me the next slide. Okay, goals for today. Basically, we're going to try to take a process which is a little bit difficult to understand and break it down. As Paul will tell you, if you have not been through this process a couple of times, there is a pretty steep learning curve in the beginning in terms of things you need to know and understand in order to successfully exit your company. We can't give you all the answers, but we at least want to sensitize you to the issues and the questions, so you have a broad sense of what the landscape looks like, and so you know when things come at you, you have some familiarity with what's going on. Finally, we are focusing a little bit more on sell side than buy side. Many of the considerations are equally important. It's one side of the coin or the other. But generally, our experience is that by the time you're buying other companies, you may have a little bit more expertise and sophistication, and so we really orient this topic a little bit more to people that are on the sell side. So I'm going to go into the next slide, and then once I get through that, I'm going to pause and give the rest of the panel a chance to chime in. Generally, our approach today is going to be, I'm going to take us through the slide in the first instance, and then leave it to the rest of the team to give color, comments, so on and so forth. I should also mention that we're going to do Q&A as we go to some extent, so feel free to enter the questions. I don't know that we will be able to get to all of them. We'll certainly get to as many of them as we can. So, general considerations. As I say to my clients all the time and repeatedly, time is not your friend. In M&A, in financing, in legal issues generally, maybe not even in life. If you're in the process, especially as the seller, moving it along as quickly as possible is important. Generally speaking, the longer a deal drags out, the longer the negotiations go on over the definitive documents, the longer the diligence goes on, bad things tend to happen. So generally speaking, moving a deal reasonably quickly is important, especially if you're on the sell side. You need to own the process in the deal. I have clients who they want to give it to me and say, you get this done. It doesn't work that way. The lawyer, the banker, the accountant, we're all key participants in the deal, but we answer to you, and you have to set the general framework for how the deal moves forward in order to get to the best result. Do not underestimate the time and the work to get it done. And Paul may want to speak about this a little bit more. It is a very intensive process. If you do not have the team in place to get it done, something is going to go badly. Either the deal will slow down, or your company is you're going to start missing your numbers, or there will be a bad result. So if you are already maxed out in terms of running your company on a day-to-day basis, then know that trying to take on selling the company in addition to running your company, it's not going to work unless you expand your resource pool in some way. Next point, devote sufficient resources to the process. Largely what we mean is time, enough time of you and other people, key members of your team. Maintain confidentiality. We'll talk about this further, but it is very important that you have a process, you have an NDA in place, and you have a process that maintains confidentiality to the maximum extent from the very beginning. Distinguish between strategic and financial buyers. Financial buyers are largely looking to you for a revenue stream. They want to know what your numbers look like. How much money are you going to bring to their bottom line? A strategic buyer, while they will often be interested in a revenue stream, they are also and often more interested in something else. It may be your IP. It may be your team. It may be your customer list. There's any number of, or your product offering, your partners, any number of things that will be important to your company that may be more important than how much money you bring to the table. That becomes important in the diligence process. It becomes important in the negotiation process because they're going to focus on certain assets more than others, and you need to be aware of that. Be realistic in negotiation. Be prepared to walk away from a bad deal. I can't tell you how many times I have clients that get enamored of the deal that's at hand, and they're not prepared to walk away, and they start negotiating down in terms of price or deal terms in a way that they're probably better off not doing, but they just get too committed to that deal. Finally, generally, always work towards the best outcome, but be prepared for the fact that things go off the rails. A meaningful minority of deals don't close, and don't think that yours won't be one of them. So you always have to be prepared for the fact that your deal may not close and not be caught flat-footed if that happens. I'll stop talking for a minute. Alan, comments?
Paul, I comment on a couple of the points you made. Number one is the importance of, acquiring a team of advisors to help you through the process. I always tell a business owner that, it's the investment banker, the lawyer's, accountant's responsibility to get you over the finish line. It's your responsibility to continue running the business during the process. And we all know the process could take anywhere from 5 or 6 months to over a year, depending upon the situation. So, and I've seen so many transactions that have fallen apart during due diligence prior to the signing of a final agreement because the company did not perform. The buyer thought he was buying a company that had $25 million of EBITDA, but in reality, the company's performance was going south and it was only $21 million of EBITDA. And once again, he's not interested. So, hire your team of advisors, let them do their job, and you do the job of running the business and continue to bring in outstanding performance.
Thank you, Alan. Absolutely. Don, thoughts?
I think, Paul, the comment you made, essentially that time kills all deals, is really important, just in so many ways, just in keeping things moving and not appearing as the seller that you're chasing the buyer to keep constructive pressure on. And usually if there's a deal to be had, you'll know soon. And if things get bogged down on little negotiation points, that's fine. But sort of hoping for somebody to sort of come back to the table or to sort of show more interest is generally not time well spent. You kind of know right away if somebody's interested or not. And then it's just a question of, getting the deal done. Agreed.
Paul?
Yeah, I think, everything here rings true. And just to really emphasize, Paul, you mentioned making sure you have a team to help run the deal process, but it's equally, if not even more important, to make sure that you have a team back home running the company. And that as you sort of get pulled deep down this rabbit hole, the company not just has to run, but has to look better than it's ever looked during this period of time. And so, your initial pitch, all the charts are going up and to the right. You have to make sure they keep doing that, and otherwise you start to lose some leverage there. And the buyer knows how long the process takes, especially if it's the sort of buyer that buys lots of companies, but this might be your first time selling a company. So they understand the process more than you do, and they're already sort of projecting that out. We'll talk about the LOI phase, but when they're making their initial offer, they know that they're not actually going to acquire this company until 6 months later, whatever it is. Like, that's already sort of baked in, and they have some model of what's supposed to happen during that time, but you don't know what it is. And so you want to make sure that you're sort of beating whatever expectation they already have sort of set. But the numbers you give them, the sort of status you give them, is not something static. They are assuming that's going to continue to grow at a similar rate or better than it's been historically, except now it has to do that without you. And by you, I think we're all sort of meaning the CEO. But other senior folks, I know, like a COO or CFO, people get pulled deep into the process. And the other thing, just to add, as far as the team at your company, is that it's also a weird thing because you're probably not telling everyone at your company what's happening until quite late in the game. In some cases, not even until after the deal closes. And so there's this, sort of secret ops nature to the whole thing that can be really tricky, because all of a sudden you're MIA, but you can't really tell anyone why you're MIA. And maybe we'll get into it, but the incentives are not the same for you as an owner and some of your employees that maybe are not. And so even if you wanted to tell them, not everyone's going to be excited about this, and all of those things are sort of racing through your head. You said at times emotional energy. I would just make a correction: all the time emotional.
All right, I will clean that up in the next version. All right, Andy, can we go to the next slide? Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the team. So real fast, who is the team? Well, it's your lawyers. it's got to be an M&A lawyer. It's got to be someone who sells deals, who sells companies all the time and does deals. You may have someone who understands your company, like your line of business. So if you're in the real estate space, so you have a real estate lawyer that helps you with all that, or whatever it is. That person may be part of the team getting the deal done, but the deal has to be headed by a lawyer who knows how to buy and sell companies. And then there'll be specialized counsel, tax, IP, employment, and regulatory, depending on what space you're in. The accountant, similarly, this should be a big part of what they do, is structuring M&A deals. Especially there are very nuanced tax issues involved, and you got to get someone who knows what they're doing. That may be your company accountant, but it may not be. Don't be wedded or beholden to your regular advisors. I mean, there will be a place for them in this process, but this is your moment. You need to have the right team. Investment banker, I'll tell you, some of the companies I sell, they don't have an investment banker in place. Generally, I regard that as a mistake. That a banker almost always adds value to the process. And they can help you find buyers, structure the process, negotiate the deal so you get a better purchase price. They can come up with comparables. They can tell you what else is happening in the marketplace. There are all sorts of value points that a banker brings. There'll be an engagement letter. Make sure your lawyer sees it. And then I'll finish this slide and turn it over to comments. The next stage in the process is going to be, actually, I'll stop there. Do you guys have comments so far? Why don't we start with Don this time?
Yeah, I liked your comment about the importance of bankers. And I think, honestly, a lot of folks say, well, I already have an interested party. Why do I need a banker? And certainly sometimes that the right answer is a negotiated process, not an auction with a banker, with a party that's at the table. But even there, I think often a banker could be helpful for the reasons you mentioned, comps and such, and also just facilitating. And very often buyers are like, well, I don't want to deal with a banker, but often a banker can smooth the process, right, with helping manage the data room. He or she has kind of seen this movie before. They can help prepare and shorten time for kind of the process to unfold. So the buyer often benefits from having a banker. The other thing a banker adds is often, they're not acting as accountants certainly, but they certainly review the financials and understand how to communicate them and really help provide context to the buyer. So I agree. Very, very often, whether you have a house lawyer or a friend who you trust, it's good to have an objective third-party banker to facilitate, the deal. So,
Alan?
One thing I would, suggest on top of what Don mentioned is bring your team in very early. Because one of the interesting things is it's not what you sell your business for, but what do you keep at the end of the day? How could the transaction be best structured to take advantage of existing tax laws, or structured from a legal basis that allows you to minimize risk both from a buyer and seller perspective? So get your team together quickly, and also bring together a team that is used to working on transactions of this size or in this particular industry. You want to hire a banker that's used to working on middle market deals, and these are the deals that gets him or her excited. Same thing for an accountant and for a lawyer. Make sure they have some specialization in your industry and they focus on companies of your size.
Thank you. Paul?
Yeah, so not to rock the boat here, but I've done a deal with a banker and without, and they both had pros and cons. So all of that is to say, I think it really depends on your unique position. If you're able to run a process, get multiple bids, and do all that yourself, that's great. But that's just the beginning of the process. Then you have the whole thing. It's kind of like, I don't know, selling a house with a broker or direct or something. Like, you can do it, but it's hard. And you don't have sort of a guide there, especially if it's your first time, which it was for me. The learning curve is steep anyway, but it's even steeper, if you're climbing the mountain without a guide. And so, so it's not only about sort of bringing deals to the table, although a good banker should be able to do that too. But it really is about sort of leading you through the whole process. But it's possible to do it without as well. And then the only thing, just thinking about, assembling the team, is internally, who is the person or who are the people on your team internally that can really help own the process with you, especially through due diligence. If it's a stock deal, and maybe we'll get deeper into that, but I mean, this is an invasive procedure you're about to go through, and who knows where the bodies are buried, or hopefully you don't have any of those, but who knows where to find all of the stuff that you're going to need to produce, and who is answering those questions. If you're sort of running things at the top level and this team here on sort of the main deal terms, but on the buyer side, there's going to be a cast of characters that, go all the way down to these kind of junior associate analyst type people, who is going back and forth with them all day, every day on the finer points, and sort of making sure that you have the same cast of characters to mirror whatever the buyer has. And there'll be some, sort of main people that you are interacting with, but then there's also going to be people that are more in the weeds, and you need to sort of mirror that on your side as well.
Thank you for that, Paul, and for your clarification on the investment banker piece. On NDA, non-solicitation agreement, look, this is very simple. You should have it in place early, and it shouldn't be what the buyer presents to you unreviewed, and it shouldn't be something you pull off the internet. It should be reviewed by your lawyer. Won't take a lawyer long, but for goodness sakes, make sure it's reviewed by a lawyer, and make sure you have it in place early in the process. Unless one of you has something to add to that, I'm just going to move to the next.
Yeah, no, just as you're switching slides, I was just going to say, if you've ever skimped on legal fees, that's fine, but this is not the time to do it. Like here in the end game, I know you're a lawyer, Paul, so just to I have no vested interest in the legal profession, but there's nothing more important than that piece of advice you just gave.
And Paul, I think you're alluding to it. You want that NDA in place before you share any information whatsoever with a potential buyer.
Absolutely.
I mean,
absolutely. Especially buyers could be competitors too.
Exactly.
It could be anybody.
Any information that you don't want to be public. I mean, that probably goes without saying, but the point is absolutely correct. Don't get lulled into complacency and go too far down the process of sharing information without having an NDA in place. Yeah, that could be a competitor. They may just be trying to, absolutely right. Enough said about that. Okay, next stage is going to be the LOI, or it could be a term sheet, depending on the deal and how it's laid out. Generally, that's presented by the buyer. Why do we have an LOI? It is not essential, but as a lawyer, I strongly recommend it. Even if doesn't have to be a full LOI, just the terms of the deal on one piece of paper, hammered out in bullet points. Even if that's all you do that. Why? It summarizes the deal terms. It makes sure that everybody's on the same page before the lawyers start drafting documents. I can't tell you how many times, like for smaller deals, someone will say, let's skip the LOI, or let's skip the term sheet and go right to drafting. And I usually push back, but sometimes I end up having to concede. And then it turns out that there wasn't agreement on a key point. And someone on my team spent a couple hours drafting provisions that there was an agreement on, that's just a waste of legal fees. So don't do it. They provide a template to the lawyers in drafting, and the LOI can help to get regulatory requirements satisfied and financing requirements. The LOI can be binding or non-binding, but don't be fooled if you sign a non-binding LOI. If the terms of a deal are in black and white on a piece of paper and you signed that piece of paper, that has significant moral authority, and it will be very difficult for you to claw back from that position further on in the process. So don't agree to something, even on a non-binding LOI, that you're not convinced you're prepared to agree to. And then even in a non-binding LOI, certain terms will be binding: confidentiality, no shop, maybe legal fees. And finally, courts can't find parties bound by non-binding terms. All in, the takeaway is be careful, even with a non-binding LOI. And lastly, but this should have been the first thing I said, don't sign an LOI without talking to your lawyer. I cannot tell you, and again, many times I've had a client or a prospective client come in and say, I'm selling my company. We negotiated the LOI. I signed it, but don't worry, it's non-binding. And I go, because I can tell you the first thing that's going to happen, we get to the negotiation table. I've gone over it. I've said to the client, well, you agreed to this, but I'm not really sure that's what you really meant. I'll say, I'll say to the other side, well, this point, this is non-binding. I wasn't involved as a lawyer. We'd like to restructure this term to say X, Y, Z. Opposing counsel, counselor, I have a term sheet here signed by your client that says the term is ABC, and the rest of the negotiation goes down like that. So don't do it. Do not sign an LOI without consulting with your lawyer. Alan, why don't we start with you?
A couple of points, Paul. Number one, I've been involved with transactions where we spend a lot of time, banging out the terms of the LOI. And when you do that and get everything kind of agreed to up front, the process of getting definitive agreements signed becomes dramatically easier. So if you spend the time up front to hammer out the LOI, you'll probably be better off, later on in the process. Number two, when you talk about deal terms, usually, you're going to, if the purchase price is based upon some multiple of EBITDA, you probably want to stipulate that in the LOI. For example, it's 7x of, trailing 12 months EBITDA, because that sort of sets the ceiling for when due diligence happens. And when due diligence occurs, you might have adjustments to EBITDA, and the EBITDA wasn't $15 million, it was 13.8, and that might necessitate a change to the purchase price. So that's an important factor. Also, really nothing starts in a deal until the LOI is signed. You can't really go talk to providers of senior debt or mezzanine debt, because banks probably will not really entertain into real discussions with you if the LOI hasn't been signed. Also, you probably don't want to start the work of your professionals, lawyers or accountants, during the due diligence process before you know that deal can get done through a signed LOI. So those are some of the points I want to make up front.
Thank you for that. Don? You're muted.
I think that's the phrase of 2021. You're on mute. Most common phrase. I think everybody covered it, really well. The one thing I find time and time again in deals is that even though it's non-binding, the LOI is used as a touchstone, so people always go back and as a point of reference, and that's why I tend to be of the view it's good to have a more rather than less detailed LOI. But otherwise, everyone's covered everything very nicely on this topic.
Thanks, Don. And Paul, to you, and I should say, Paul, the reason I keep going to you last is not because I like you least, but I'm giving you the chance to call BS on.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love it. I'm like Simon Cowell, So, the LOI is like getting engaged to be married, right? Like there's a long process to plan the wedding. And both parties have to sort of say, are we doing this? Yes. Like, and sort of, to me, besides the specifics of it, it really is the letter of intention. Both sides are saying, I intend to really do this. Now, in most cases, there's, exclusivity solely on the part of the seller. On the seller. At least in my case, there was. So basically, we're engaged to be married. I'm not allowed to date anyone else, but you can, and you don't need to tell me about it. And there's a power dynamic there at play. I'm sure in some cases, maybe the seller has more power, or you agree in both cases. But for me, that's a bit, it felt precarious that it's kind of like, okay, I'm locked in, like I'm committed to you for this period. But from the buyer side, in theory, there's really no downside to them signing a non-binding LOI with a 60-day exclusive period because, but the thing is that it is really clarifying, despite that, for both sides, to say, look, we're coming to the table, we agree on the main terms. The only thing that I'll add is that, at least for us, if you're lucky and you get lots of simultaneous LOIs, there's a real sense of being rushed. And, I totally agree with some of the previous comments about really taking your time up front, getting the terms right, because that's going to save you, headache and misunderstandings down the line. And that all totally makes sense. But in the moment, it feels like a very highly pressurized situation. A lot of these LOIs have sort of, an exploding end date. If you don't sign by Friday, deal's off the table, that kind of thing. And so again, if things go right, you actually have multiple exploding offers all on the table, and you're making calls and you're talking to your board members and your advisors and your investors and your co-founders, and everyone's crying and everyone's excited and everyone, it's a really intense period. And somehow in the midst of that, you're supposed to be negotiating the very perfect terms that you're going to be happy with 6 months from now and for the rest of your life. And so it's not for the faint of heart, for sure. But one piece of more tangible advice there is, before you start the process, you and whoever the other stakeholders are on your end, maybe have the conversation about what you want your terms to be. At least, a range of possibilities. This is the price we'd be happy with. These are the terms we'd be happy with. Am I going with the deal? Am I, exiting the company? Are we, like, these sorts of things? At least if the internal conversations, if those can happen in advance, then at least the negotiation is happening between sort of a unified front on your end and whoever the prospective buyers might be. But I think in a lot of cases, some of those deeper conversations haven't happened quite yet. And so it's not only that you're negotiating with the buyer, but you're sort of negotiating internally with your stakeholders simultaneously. And the whole thing can be really intensive. The good news is, once you've signed an LOI, there is sort of like a moment of kind of like, okay, we've crossed some big impasse here, and now we can just get down to the business of getting this deal over the finish line. But the more you can sort of plan in advance, the better.
Thank you for that, Paul. We're going to go now to due diligence, the next topic. It takes a long time, quite difficult, quite invasive. I mean, they will want to know everything. It'll be business, financial, legal. I should say that some of the diligence, high-level business diligence, I mean, there are going to be conversations that happen, while the LOI is being negotiated, probably to some extent. And that's, or before the LOI is negotiated. So it doesn't all happen after the LOI, but do make sure that negotiation happens after the NDA is signed. So in any event, business, financial, legal, it should be staged. Now, something I meant to say about the NDA, I'll say it now. You should, every company has something that is like the crown jewels, the thing that they're really buying, especially a strategic buyer. It may be your IP, it may be your customer list, it may be your team, whatever it is. A strategic buyer is probably interested in something about the company more than something else. Identify what that is and be careful about how and when that gets turned over to the other side. Now, in all likelihood, one way or another, the buyer will need to get at least some level of access to those crown jewels before they sign the deal. And that's to be expected. That's what they're buying. But be careful about how and when that happens. There may be certain information you hold back until late in the process and only release under certain, controlled circumstances. Because, as we said, deals go south, and you don't want to have given access to the crown jewels, and then have the deal go under. Now, you have an NDA in place, but that means, okay, that's nice. Now that means you have a lawsuit against the buyer. Suppose it's Apple trying to buy your company. So now you have litigation against Apple or Google. Good luck with that. You've got a right, but do you have an effective remedy? So I always say protecting the company is about having an NDA, but also being circumspect about how and when you release information. The other advisors, we do deals like this all the time, and we can smell when things aren't going right, when a deal isn't moving quickly enough, when the other side is holding back, whatever. And we may be able to say to you, be careful about how much you're giving over to these guys because we're not convinced this deal is going to close. So anyway, disclosure, full disclosure helps you. When you're required to produce information to the seller, there's maybe a question of when it gets disclosed, but it should be disclosed. Bad news, disclose it. This will come into the contracting process. If you have disclosed the bad news about the company, every company has bad news. If you've disclosed it, that buys you some protection after the fact. But with the bad news, don't try to hide it. All right, I said that. Don't try to hide it, but you should know about it before the buyer knows about it. So if there is something, if there is a skeleton in the closet of your company, you should know about those skeletons first, and you should manage the process of turning them over to the other side. Well, this litigation came up. This is how we dealt with it, and don't let them discover it. You should alert them to it. Prepare in advance. Virtual data room is how things are usually done these days. Don, when you speak, you may have some comments about quality of earnings. I think that was Don who brought that up. And the cleaner your records are in the beginning, the easier it'll be. Going back to my comment earlier, you should be preparing 12, 18 months in advance to have everything ready when that day comes. Finally, don't neglect buy-side diligence. If you are getting stock in the buyer, if there's going to be an earnout, you have a vested interest in the success of the buyer over the long term. You may want to have your lawyer, your accountant, do some diligence so you know what you're buying into. Alan, I'll turn it over to you, and I'll say to the panelists, we're going to have to move a little bit faster. So anyway.
Paul, just a couple of quick points. I think the one thing I'll say up front, sellers who are prepared for diligence or sellers that are diligence ready before they enter the process usually get a higher price for their business. The buyer perceives the company as being well run, very efficient. So, as a seller of a business, I don't think you can wake up on Monday and say, well, I want to go into the market on Friday with my company. After you made a decision to sell, make sure that you're you begin to put your virtual data room together and your diligence ready to go through any scrutiny that a buyer might put you through.
Thank you. Don?
Yeah, I'll just do a quick comment on quality of earnings reports. I think that in any market environment, I was going to say the current market environment, because time is so precious and everyone's so busy, it's generally a good idea to hire an accounting firm to do a quality of earnings report. It's not like an audit. It's basically a due diligence report on the financials. And buyers love it. It saves time for them. It's a vote of confidence. They will do one anyway, so presenting one potentially avoids them doing one, or they'll do a lighter one. And you need to spend the time to prepare your model anyway, your financial model. So we think if you can afford the time, and there is some cost to it, it's worthwhile.
Paul? Yeah, we can't hear you, Paul.
You're on mute.
No, we're not hearing you. Nope. Andy, thoughts? Okay, so Paul's coming back. So we're going to go on for a moment. We'll circle back. Let's go to next slide, Andy, on the M&A process. We're just going to hit these. Okay, here's Paul. Paul?
Any better?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
There we go.
Okay.
The old refresh. The only thing on due diligence that I was going to add is I really didn't understand the difference between a stock deal versus an asset deal. And my two deals ended up being one of each. So I sort of have a direct comparison here. But for those that aren't familiar, in a stock deal, the buyer is actually buying the stock in your company. They are inheriting not just your technology, if it's a technology company, or your team, or your customers, your revenue, but all of your liability and if somebody from 5 years ago comes to sue you, well, you is now the buyer. Like, they are you are them, they own the whole thing. And so they're inheriting everything that's ever happened, versus an asset deal where they are acquiring a set of assets, even if it ends up being sort of, almost all of your company basically leaving nothing left. But by not taking the corporate entity itself, they're not inheriting all of that same liability. And so the diligence process is a bit different depending on if they are inheriting all of those potential liabilities or not. And so it's something to consider. And then depending on how your company is structured, there are different financial benefits or not to each of those structures. In an asset deal, you're recognizing that essentially as revenue. So if you're a C Corp, you're going to get sort of taxed there twice. But anyway, those are considerations, obviously, to talk to with your lawyer and with whoever. Also can actually be a negotiating point depending on what the buyer wants and what you want. But I think can impact the diligence process as well, beyond just the financial considerations.
Paul, thank you for that. So now we move on from diligence. We'll go through these points quickly. Alongside of diligence, you have the drafting and negotiation of the definitive documents. This is largely something done by your lawyer with some lawyers with some input from your accountants and maybe your banker. There's a lot here. This is really where the lawyers earn their money to a great extent, because the LOI is more of a high-level business people and lawyers together figuring it out. At the definitive documents, it becomes more the lawyers really digging down to the legal nitty-gritty. But you cannot neglect that process. You as a CEO or as a C-level executive, you still need to understand what the issues are. You need to guide your team in how those issues get resolved. Disclosure schedules are where the company indicates all of the bad news. We can put it that way. Any negative information about the company gets listed in the disclosure schedules. It's also a list of different types of agreements. So all of the material contracts that the company has, all of NDAs, a current cap table. It's related to the diligence process, but it's basically you putting all of the information about the company on paper and saying, this is the situation of the company. As I said before, it's very important that you are very complete, that everything gets onto those tables, onto those schedules. Because if something comes up later, if the company has a loss and there was some negative information about the company that should have been on that schedule and was not, the buyer will come back to you and say, this is, you did not give full disclosure about the company. I suffered because of it, and you owe me money. So the disclosure schedules are very important. Then comes signing. Pretty straightforward. By the time the documents are getting there is a headache, but the signing is relatively straightforward. Some deals are simultaneous, sign and close. So everything happens at once. Sometimes they're consecutive. There'll be some delay before closing. That gives an opportunity for third-party consents. If your landlord needs to sign a lease or certain counterparties to your agreements need to sign consents, regulatory issues get resolved. Then comes the closing, where the company, the equity or the assets actually change hands. And then there are post-closing matters. There may be price adjustments based on the working capital that was agreed to in the definitive documents. Escrow claims and releases. I referenced back, if there was a disclosure problem, something wasn't disclosed, there will often be money held back from the purchase price to pay for any bad news that comes up after the closing that the buyer was not informed of. I am summarizing a process which is much more in depth. So I forgive me for there's a lot of detail here, but I'm trying to give you a high level, as founders, a high level sense of what the issues are. Indemnification is how the sellers may end up having to pay back a portion of the purchase price after closing for certain things that were negotiated in the definitive documents, or bad things that happened after the closing that they sort of committed wouldn't happen. That's a very sort of broadly put. And that comes out of escrow, the money that's held back. And then if there are earnouts, post-closing, you will work in the company towards your earnout milestones so that you can get that portion of the purchase price that was contingent upon performance after closing. And I will stop there. I will this time turn it over to Don.
Yeah, actually, somebody in the audience had a good question that may be worth bringing up around how to address the question of integration with key positions for management, what to watch out for in terms of treatment of management and employees. So I don't know, Paul, if that's a topic you want to bring up now, but I wanted just to highlight that in the definitive document negotiation on that point that Rob raised, the treatment of employees and management often is not directly covered in the M&A purchase agreement, but there often are employment agreements that need to be signed as a condition to close. And so it's important to see those and know what those are. And oftentimes a buyer will require a certain percentage of employees to sign on. So knowing what that expectation and knowing what is being offered to the employees to see if that expectation can be met is very important. So not to take it off track, but it sort of relates to this area. But that's an important related part of the drafting process. So,
thank you, Alan.
I was just going to add, Paul, it's not unique that a seller has conversations with a financial or strategic buyer about his key employees and what roles they might have in NewCo. And it's also not strange for sellers to have stay bonuses available to their key employees to make sure that they at least stay through the end of a transaction.
Yes, agreed. Thank you. Paul?
Yeah, one of the first things you said that sort of this process, especially the definitive documents, really falls to the lawyers. But that being said, you want to make sure you're still keyed into that process. And the one thing that your lawyers and the rest of your team will never know and shouldn't be expected to know is really what is vitally important to you and what are you willing to give. And that it's important to sort of keep a pulse on the process, because sometimes you might find that your team is fighting on your behalf over something you don't care that much about, and maybe not fighting enough on something you really do care about. And just trying to sort of help everyone understand you're never going to get everything you want. And so how to prioritize those things, how to time them, in the spirit of time kills all deals, as you get to the end, everyone sort of gets deal fatigue, and both sides are willing to just sort of say, like, yeah, whatever. And that actually, it might be the magical ingredient that gets deals done in the end. But also you want to make sure the things you do care about are handled when you have the energy to address them early in the process, and not sort of leave them till the end. And the other thing I'll say there is just to make sure you have a direct line to the buyer. At some point, the lawyers start talking to each other, or if you're working with a banker. But sometimes it is the right thing to do to sort of say, you know what, I'm going to go straight to the source, especially on the main terms of the deal, because those are really business terms rather than legal terms. And sometimes you sort of have to come in, have those conversations business to business side, and then sort of kick it back to legal.
Thank you for that. And we were able to address that question to some extent, which is good. Thank you for bringing that up, Don. Okay, we've got 4 slides to go in 12 minutes, so we're going to do some lightning rounds, okay? We've touched on some of this. We talked about, well, I should mention, the LOI has sort of been touched on. That's when the seller has maximum leverage, so make sure you use it. After it's signed, deal terms as a seller only get worse for you, generally speaking. Very rarely do they get better. Bad facts come out. News of the transaction starts to get out there. Go back to one of Paul's points here, the company's financial position may begin to erode. So the buyer has interest in, a longer exclusivity period. Get as much information as early as they can, and keeping as much flexibility as they can. Whereas the seller, would rather have no exclusivity period or a limited one, and lock in the price and other key deal terms at that point. Ambiguity is not your friend. As a seller, you want things as much certainty as possible, because things are only going to get worse for you from that point going forward. I'm not. If any of you has something to add to that, and I'm sure you do, I'll just leave it to someone to jump in.
Paul, I was involved in an interesting process a couple of years ago where, the seller's banker actually, received several letters of intent for the business. And as part of that process, and the seller had also done sell-side due diligence early on, and the sell-side due diligence report wasn't available to buyers until after they had submitted an LOI. So after he received, several LOIs for the business, he went back to, the top 3 or 4 candidates and said, now here's the sell side due diligence report that was done prior. Now go back and sharpen your pencils and submit new offers. And it was a pretty interesting way of, maximizing value. And it did do that in the long run. Don, I don't know if you've seen similar processes used in your business.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I would definitely agree. So.
Paul, anything to add?
No, I think this is exactly right.
All right. So now we're going to go on to the LOI itself and just take a quick survey through some deal terms. Paul already touched on the issue of the transaction structure, whether it's a stock or an asset sale. Important distinction. It has tax implications. It also other impacts. It will and a stock deal is more likely to expose the seller to in an asset deal, the liabilities may get left. Some of the liabilities may get left behind with the sellers, whereas a stock deal, more likely the liabilities go along. In an asset deal, all of the assets and liabilities need to be listed in the transfer and assumed. There are third-party consents that are more prevalent in the asset situation. So that's an important issue to address early on, and something that will be discussed among all of your advisors, your banker, your lawyer, and especially your accountants on the tax issues. The price, not only the total amount, but how it's paid. Is it cash? Is it stock, or a note, or some combination of those, or maybe an earnout? As far as earnouts go, often we resort to them in deals, but I'll say to you, as a deal lawyer, I try to avoid them for my client's sake. I try to avoid going to an earnout because they are difficult and time consuming to negotiate. Generally, nobody is really happy with them, and they breed litigation after the closing. But sometimes that's the only way to bring the parties together. Any thoughts on that among the team? Or shall we move on? All right. Then we have other non-binding terms. As we mentioned, in an asset deal, there will be a description of the assets and liabilities. That is something that can add costs, frankly, to an asset deal, because can be a time-consuming process. There will be financial assumptions and maybe purchase price adjustments. We talked a little bit about employment. Key employees are very often an important part of a deal. So employment agreements will be part of the high-level employment terms will often be part of the LOI. Who's going along? What's their comp going to be? How long do they have to stay? Non-competition provisions. If you're selling your company, likely you're going to be bound by a non-compete that may go 5 years or so. Non-key employees. There may not be a requirement that they go along with the deal, but you as a CEO may be concerned about how they're going to be treated. Are they going to be fairly treated post-closing? Purchase price allocation. How does the price get allocated among different types of assets? This drives a lot of the tax considerations. Indemnification we touched on. How much money gets held back to pay for things that come up after the closing, where you as the seller may end up owing a portion of the purchase price back to the buyer. That is a painful situation when it happens, and it's a key part of every purchase agreement, whether it's a stock deal or an asset deal. And then founder liability. Sometimes founders will need to be personally liable for certain types of reps and warranties. For example, if it turns out that there's a problem with the fundamental IP, that may be a rep that the founder has to stand behind personally. Now, everything is negotiable. You don't have to agree to it, but that may be the cost of getting a deal done. Team, comments?
Paul, just one comment on the employee relationships and terms of agreements. Probably a much more common element when you're being acquired by a financial buyer rather than a strategic buyer, where the people become so much more important to the deal. So just something to consider.
Yep, that probably is. Anyone else?
Yeah, no, I think this is right. I think, the LOI it's funny. The things that you want to make sure end up in the final deal, you want to get in, and the things you don't want, you want to make sure don't get in. So it's like, you know, the wiggle room is where whatever's not in the LOI, you know, and so everyone's trying to get their things in so that they're kind of locked in. But again, I can't emphasize enough, at least in my experience, how sort of frantic this LOI period can feel. And so if you're not really sure on something, see if you can actually punt it out of the LOI, you know, to be discussed, to be whatever. And that, by the way, is a double-edged sword, because you're leaving yourself exposed to potentially bad terms later, but you're not committing to something that you're not fully comfortable with. And I think the other thing I would recommend, just as practical advice, is to sort of note, and I'm sure the buyer's doing this too, what is the information you have at this time, at the time of the LOI, that you're basing your decisions on? And if new information or that information is somehow updated in the future, I think that is reasonable in goodwill to come back and say, hey, you know, I was working under this assumption at the time, but now I've learned that X is actually Y. I want to revisit this term. The buyer won't be hesitant to do that too. If it turns out that something they thought was true turns out not to be true, they will also maybe revisit some of those terms. And so, you know, just to sort of keep a record of the decisions you're making are based on certain information that you have at that time, but over the course of the deal, new information might enter the fold. And you know, that's the only way I see to sort of alter what was in the LOI in good faith, is to sort of come back and say, you know, there's new information that we just didn't know about at that time. But to do that, you have to be able to sort of show that you weren't aware of that at that time. But otherwise, even if it's not binding, going back and trying to change something from the LOI is just kind of like uncouth to do, you know.
Yes, and it'll likely cost you someone else. Andy, we can take the last slide. All right, going forward, reps, warranties, covenants, and survival periods. Well, we talked, reps and warranties are where you say, you know, we have no litigation against us, or the only litigation we have is X. We own all our IP. We own all of our assets, or here's a list of our assets, or here's a list of our material agreements, or the agreements with the following key customers are all in force and effect. You know, you have to stand behind all of these things. And if you get any of them wrong, heaven help you, because this is where, after the fact, after the closing, after you've got your money in the bank, the buyer can say, oh no, you told us it was X, it turned out to be Y, pay up. Okay, so get that right and get the disclosure right. Key closing conditions, like, you know, the agreement with this key customer that we need is still in effect, or, you know, your EBITDA is at least X. You know, there may be certain things that should be in the LOI to make sure that, you know, everyone's clear that they're a key term for the deal. Same, any critical terms that are critical to the parties that are not customary, same sort of thing, and a proposed closing date. That's all non-binding, to the extent anything is non-binding in an LOI. Binding terms we touched on before, the lockup, you know, the exclusivity period and the breakup fee. If the deal doesn't go forward, if you don't sell, if you sell to someone else, how much you owe the buyer. Confidentiality that exists during and after the LOI period. Conduct of business from the time the LOI is signed until the time the definitive documents are signed. There may be limitations on what you can do with the business during that period. Usually relatively modest, but they can be there. Allocation of costs sometimes with respect to legal fees, and termination date of the LOI. Anything to add, guys?
Paul, real quickly, one of the interesting terms today is that the issue of proposed closing date. And I think, as everyone knows, most sellers, because of pending changes in tax law, are trying to close deals by 12/31. And it's going to be interesting to see how many actually get across the finish line and how this issue is going to be revised in mid-December. So just an interesting point. I don't know if anyone else has any comments on that.
Could work in your favor if you're trying to get a deal done this year.
It could. All right, we're out of time. I'm going to give you each 30 seconds for final thoughts. Don, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thank you. I really enjoyed the panel. I think one of the things that's evident here is that service providers, lawyers, accountants, and bankers can really help in a process to facilitate, to prepare, and also to guide what's market, right? Because deals are not negotiated in a vacuum. There's a history and there's a reason, and I think having folks that do it for a living can help guide to that. And in terms of what Alan had said, there are a lot of deals trying to squeeze through the pipe into this year. Larger ones are going to likely get held up for Hart-Scott-Rodino antitrust review. But I'd say broadly, tax from a deal structure standpoint is very important, but that tax from a deal timing standpoint shouldn't drive whether you and when you transact. So, because it's so hard to sort of time things, and folks will try to gain an advantage on that. But really enjoyed speaking with everybody, and anybody that has questions on M&A on the banking side, always happy to chat offline. So thank you.
Thank you, Don. Alan?
Thanks, Paul. 3 quick points. One, I don't want to de-emphasize the importance of team. You have to have a great team around you, externally and internally. Great time to be a seller today because of the availability of capital, and multiples are at historic highs, and it's going to take longer than you think. So,
all right, Paul, you've got cleanup.
It'll take even longer than that. It is hard to manufacture urgency, but urgency is what gets LOIs going. Urgency is what gets deals closed. Using deadlines, arbitrary deadlines, like it's the end of the year, it's whatever, those can work in your favor. But wherever you can, you're the one that's going to have to beat the drum. And I think you had this in an earlier slide, Paul, but just to call it back, you have to really lead the process. Your law firm is running multiple deals, not just yours. The buyer might be running multiple deals, not just yours. But you are the only person on the planet, or your other partners or whoever, that care about this deal as much as you do. And so it means the most to you, and you have to be the one to really lead it and to feel that, and to really put yourself in the driver's seat and realize that you are autonomous in the process, and you don't have to say yes to things, but that at the same time, there's that expression: would you rather be happy or would you rather be right? And you have to make that call at each juncture.
All right, those are great words to go out on, Paul. Thank you. Thank you to the panel. Really great conversation. We'll be staying around for networking. I think most of the team can stay. Contact information will be in the deck. We will be circulating the video and the deck, so keep an eye open for it. Thank you all again, and thank you all to the attendees. Take care.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Thank you.